And we are back. Welcome, everyone, to the Fulcrum Intel Digest. This is it, the premiere of Season 2.
It feels good to be back.
It really does. We've spent the hiatus, really digging into the archives, looking for research that doesn't just describe what's happening in the news cycle.
Right.
We wanted to find work that explains the fundamental mechanics of what's going on beneath the headlines.
I think that's the right focus. The focus this season is definitely shifting away from the, let's call it the breaking news churn.
Mm-hmm.
And we're trying to understand the tectonic plates that are moving underneath everything.
Tectonic plates. That's the perfect way to put it. We're looking at structure, not just noise.
Yeah.
And before we dive into the deep end today, I do have a quick request for everyone listening.
Okay.
Since this is the start of a new season, if you want to make sure you don't miss any of these briefings, now is the perfect time. Go ahead and hit subscribe right now on whatever app you're using.
It really does help.
It makes a huge difference. And if you're on a platform that has likes or ratings, giving us a quick click there, it actually tells the algorithm to serve this content to other people who are, trying to make sense of the world just like we are.
So thank you in advance.
Yes, thank you for that. Now, let's get to it.
Let's do it.
I want to start with a feeling that I think a lot of us have had over the last few years. Do you remember the 1990s?
I do, vaguely. The era of, what was it? Irrational exuberance.
Yeah.
Optimism, definitely.
End of history, right. Francis Fukuyama. The Berlin Wall was down, the Soviet Union had just collapsed.
Right.
And there was this overwhelming sense, this feeling in the air that the big debate was over.
The argument had been settled.
Exactly. Liberal democracy and free market capitalism led by the United States had won. The world was unipolar. Mm-hmm. The U.S. was the grandmaster on the global chessboard, and pretty much everyone else was just trying to figure out how to be a pawn that didn't get sacrificed.
It was a very specific, very unique moment in time. The unipolar moment, as Charles Krauthammer called it.
Yes.
But looking back now, from where we are in early 2026, that era feels like ancient history. It's a completely different planet.
And that is the entire premise of the conversation we're having today. We are not in that world anymore.
Not even close.
We are firmly, undeniably in a multipolar era. We see it every single day. You have China, which is asserting itself not just economically, but, militarily and diplomatically.
You have a revanchist Russia, completely disrupting the European security order.
You have India playing its own game, a completely independent game. But the question that I think often gets lost in this clash of titans narrative is, where does Africa fit into all of this?
And that's the critical question, isn't it? Because usually, in Western geopolitical analysis, Africa is treated as the stage.
Right, not the actor.
Exactly. It's the board where the game is played, or it's the prize to be won. It's all about resources. It's about strategic port access, but it's very rarely about agency.
Is the continent just a spectator in all this? Is it just a resource pit for these other great powers to fight over? Or, and this is the interesting part, as the global order fractures, is there an opening, an opportunity for Africa to become a player in its own right?
Well, to answer that, we are going to do a deep dive into a really, really significant piece of scholarship that just came out.
Okay.
It's a paper from Fulcrum Analytics titled Africa and the Emerging Multipolar World Order, Repositioning the Continent Through Strategic Diplomacy and Economic Engagement.
All right, give us the details on this. Who wrote it and why this paper specifically?
It was published very recently, October 28, 2025. The author is Oyelayo Daniel Adiyinka. He's a scholar from Osun State University in Nigeria, Unison.
Okay.
And what makes this paper stand out to me, why we chose it, is that Adiyinka isn't looking at this from a purely Western, realist perspective.
Right.
Nor is he looking at it from a purely idealistic Pan-Africanist perspective. He's sitting right at this really interesting intersection of media, diplomacy, and leadership. He's interested in the mechanics of it all. How does a continent actually rebrand itself and rebuild its leverage on the world stage?
And the key term he uses, and I think we're going to be using it a lot today, is diplomatic repositioning.
Repositioning. It's an active word. It implies movement. It implies intent.
So let's outline our mission for this deep dive. We're going to break this down into a few clear sections. First, we have to understand what diplomatic repositioning actually means. What does it entail to move from the periphery to the center?
From theory to practice.
Exactly. Yeah. Second, we're going to look at the economic engine that has to be behind this. Specifically, the African Continental Free Trade Area, the AFCFTA, and why it's so much more than just a trade deal. Third, and this is the big one, we're going to do a deep case study on Nigeria. because the source argues it's the bellwether for the entire continent.
As goes Nigeria, so goes Africa. That's the thinking.
Pretty much. We'll look at the specific diplomatic blitz that happened in late 2025. Then we'll zoom out and get into the institutions BRICS, the G20, the UN Security Council.
And finally, we have to play devil's advocate. We have to look at the risks, the internal friction, the governance problems that could derail this entire project before it even gets off the ground.
It's a lot to cover.
It is, but it flows logically. We go from the big idea, to the money, to the state-level action, to the global stage, and then we end with a reality check.
I like it. So let's start with section 1, the paradigm shift. The paper talks about moving from periphery to center. Can you walk us through the geopolitical landscape that Adiyinka describes?
Well, he starts exactly where we did, by acknowledging the death of that unipolar world.
Right.
But he makes a crucial point. For Africa, that unipolar world was largely a period of dependency. The relationships were almost entirely defined by what he calls post-colonial alliances.
Break that down for us, post-colonial alliances. It sounds very polite, very diplomatic, but what does it mean in practice?
In practice, it means your hands are tied. It means that if you were a former French colony, your economy, your military doctrine, your currency, it was all tied to Paris.
The CFA franc zone.
A prime example. If you were a former British colony, you looked to London and, by extension, Washington. The partnerships were vertical. They went from south to north. You extracted raw materials, copper, cocoa, oil sent them north, and then you bought back finished goods, often made from your own resources. Diplomatically, you voted with your patron at the UN.
It sounds less like a partnership and more like a guardianship.
That's a great way to put it.
You might get an allowance in the form of foreign aid, but you absolutely do not get to decide how the household is run.
Precisely. And in a unipolar world, what choice did you have? Who else were you going to turn to? The Soviet Union was gone. China was still mostly focused inward.
Right.
But in a multipolar world, suddenly you have options. You have choices.
All of these new players on the board.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You have China showing up, offering to build a high-speed rail line with, no questions asked about your human rights record. You have Turkey offering highly effective security drones. You have Russia offering, security contractors and energy deals.
You have Brazil and India offering agricultural technology that's actually suited for tropical climates.
The menu of options has just exploded. And so the repositioning that Adiyinka talks about is this fundamental shift from those old post-colonial alliances to interest-based coalitions.
And that's the key phrase right there, interest-based coalitions.
That's the whole game. It's transactional, but in a healthy, sovereign kind of way.
So what does that look like?
It means an African nation can say, okay, we will work with China on building this port because they offer the best financing and they do it fast. But we're going to work with the United States on counterterrorism in the Sahel because they have the best intelligence sharing.
And we'll work with the EU on green energy transition because they have the capital and the technology for it.
Precisely. You don't have to pick a side in some new global Cold War. You don't have to pledge allegiance. You pick the partner that serves your immediate national interest for that specific issue.
That sounds a lot like the non-alignment strategy from the original Cold War. Is this just non-alignment 2.0?
It's similar in spirit, but I think it has more agency. Adiyinka's argument is that the original non-alignment movement was often about just trying to stay out of the crossfire.
Just trying not to get crushed by the two elephants in the room?
Yes. This new repositioning is more proactive. It's about actively shaping the agenda, not just reacting to it.
Okay.
And to really get it, the source breaks it down into 4 distinct dimensions. He says, if you want to understand how Africa is trying to move from being an object of history to a subject of history, you have to look at these 4 pillars.
Okay, let's walk through them. What's the first dimension?
The first is ideological. This is the mental shift. It's the most abstract, but maybe the most important. It's about breaking that psychological dependency that says expertise comes from the West, that the models for development have to come from the World Bank or a university in London. It involves asserting that African solutions like, say, local conflict resolution mechanisms or indigenous economic models are actually valid and maybe even superior for their context. It's about self-determination in the realm of ideas.
Which is incredibly hard to quantify, but I see how it's essential. If you don't believe you belong at the head of the table, you'll naturally sit at the back of the room.
Exactly. You won't even try to sit at the head. Okay, the second dimension is diplomatic.
This is more concrete.
Much more. This is the structural fight for representation. It's the explicit demand for permanent seats on the UN Security Council. It's the fight for more voting rights in the IMF and the World Bank. It's getting a real voice at the G20.
It's about changing the bylaws of the global club.
That's it. It's a fight over the rules of the game.
We'll definitely get into the weeds of that UN seat later because that is a complex beast. What's the third dimension?
Economic. This is the engine for everything else. You cannot be a sovereign diplomatic power if your budget is dependent on foreign aid.
You can't be.
So this dimension focuses squarely on things like the African Continental Free Trade Area. It's about creating a massive internal market so you aren't entirely at the mercy of export markets in the West or in China.
Building economic resilience from within. And the fourth?
The fourth is structural. This is the highest level, the most ambitious.
Okay.
It implies shaping international norms. It's moving from being a rule taker, a country that just signs the treaties on climate or trade that are written in Geneva or New York, to a rule maker.
Someone who helps write the treaty in the first place.
Someone who's in the room when the first draft is being written, shaping the very ideas that underpin global governance.
Rule maker. That is a bold ambition. Historically, the Global South has almost always been the rule taker.
Almost without exception. And that's why this is such a significant tectonic shift. But let's be real, and the source is very clear on this. You can have all the ideological ambition in the world.
But as the saying goes, you can't have a voice if you don't have the money.
Exactly.
Which transitions us perfectly to Section 2, the economic engine. The source, as you said, focuses heavily on the AfCFTA. Now, I feel like we've been hearing about the African Continental Free Trade Area for years.
For a long time, yes.
It's often described in these grand terms, this holy grail of African development. But, trade deals are usually pretty boring. Why is this one the linchpin of the whole repositioning strategy?
It comes down to the fragmentation problem. Just look at a map of Africa.
Okay.
That map was carved up in Berlin in 1884 by European powers. The borders don't make any economic sense. They split ethnic groups, they cut off natural trade routes.
They were designed for extraction, not integration.
100%. So what you're left with is 54 small, fragmented markets. And the absurdity of it is that it is often harder and much more expensive to ship a container from Lagos, Nigeria to Accra, Ghana, which are relatively close, than it is to ship that same container to London or Shanghai.
That is just insane when you think about it.
It's the direct legacy of colonial infrastructure. The roads and the railways all lead to the ports to take things out of the continent. They don't connect to each other, to facilitate trade within the continent.
So the AfCFTA is trying to fundamentally rewrite that logic.
It's trying to build the horizontal connections. The source highlights a key statistic on this. Since its launch in 2020, the AfCFTA has facilitated over $10 billion in intra-African trade.
Okay, I want to push back on that number for a second. $10 billion. In the context of the global economy, or even just the GDP of a mid-sized American state, that sounds like peanuts. Why should we be impressed by $10 billion spread over 5 years?
That's a totally fair critique if you just look at the raw volume. Compared to intra-EU trade, which is in the trillions, it's a drop in the bucket, no question.
So what's the real story?
You have to look at the rate of change and, more importantly, the type of trade that's starting to happen. Historically, intra-African trade has been abysmal, somewhere around 15% of total African trade.
15.
In Europe, intra-European trade is something like 70%.
A massive difference.
So the growth to $10 billion, while small, represents a cracking of the dam. It's the start of a new trend.
So it's a proof of concept more than anything.
It's a proof of concept. And even more importantly, it's about how that trade happens. One of the biggest non-tariff barriers to trade in Africa has always been currency conversion.
Right.
If a merchant in Kenya wants to buy goods from a supplier in Nigeria, they usually have to convert their Kenyan shillings to US dollars first. Then they send the dollars. Then the Nigerian supplier converts those dollars back to Naira.
And every step of that process costs money.
It costs money. And it means they're completely dependent on the US banking system and the availability of dollars in their local market. It basically acts as a tax on every single transaction.
And it gives the US Federal Reserve incredible leverage over their internal trade.
That's right. So the AMCFTA is pushing mechanisms like the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, or PAPSS.
Right.
It's a bit technical, but it allows them to trade directly in their own local currencies.
Cutting out the middleman.
Cutting out the dollar.
Yeah.
And so that $10 billion figure, a lot of that is starting to move through these new channels. That's a move toward real economic sovereignty, which is why the source describes the AFCFTA not just as a trade deal, but as a foreign policy instrument.
Explain that connection. How is a trade agreement foreign policy?
Because it creates what he calls collective capacities. Think about it. If 54 countries negotiate with a powerhouse like China individually, they get steamrolled.
Of course.
China's economy is larger than all of theirs combined. They can dictate terms. Here's the deal. Take it or leave it. Okay. But if Africa negotiates as a unified single market of 1.3 billion people, which is the same size as China or India, suddenly you're a heavyweight. You're not begging for investment anymore. You are defining the terms of access to your massive market.
It's all about leverage.
All about leverage. The source uses this very biting phrase to describe the old way of doing things. It says, this shift moves Africa away from exploitative altruistic partnerships.
Exploitative altruistic. I love that phrasing. It perfectly captures the dynamic.
It's brilliant, isn't it?
It's the idea of, here, I'm giving you aid, look how good and generous I am, while at the same time you're extracting 10 times that value in resources or interest payments on old debt.
It's the velvet glove over the iron fist. The ACFTA is the attempt to take off the glove and shake hands as equals.
Okay, so we've established the theory of repositioning, and we have the economic machinery in the AFCFTA. But these broad continental trends can be, a bit abstract and hard to track.
They can.
So the paper wisely zooms in on a specific, powerful case study, Nigeria.
The giant of Africa.
Exactly. My first question is, why focus so heavily on Nigeria? Is it just because the author is Nigerian, so there's a home field bias?
There might be a little bit of that, sure.
Yeah.
But objectively, you cannot talk about African geopolitics without putting Nigeria at the center of the conversation.
Why not?
It's the most populous nation, over 200 million people. It's the continent's largest economy, despite all its challenges. And its cultural influence, through Nollywood, through Afrobeats music, spans the entire globe.
So the source argues that Nigeria is the bellwether.
It is. The argument is that if this project of repositioning fails in Nigeria with all its resources and human capital, then it's likely to fail for the rest of the continent as well.
So Nigeria is the test kitchen. If the recipe works there, it can be exported.
A very volatile, very complicated test kitchen, but yes.
The source talks specifically about what it calls the Tinubu doctrine. This refers to President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, who came into power in 2023. How does the paper characterize his foreign policy, especially compared to his predecessor, Muhammadu Buhari?
The contrast they paint is quite sharp. The Buhari administration was often characterized, fairly or unfairly, by a more introverted, almost cautious approach to foreign policy. That was partly due to the president's health issues and partly just a difference in temperament. The source describes the shift under Tinubu as moving from passive engagement to active engagement.
And what are the pillars of that doctrine?
The paper lays out three: sovereignty first and foremost, economic pragmatism second, and a renewed focus on regional leadership third.
And this active engagement isn't just rhetoric. The source points to a specific, very intense period in late 2025 where Tinubu went on what some in the media were calling a diplomatic blitz.
Yes, the famous working vacation. That wasn't really a vacation at all.
Right. And there was a lot of noise in the Nigerian domestic media about this, about the cost of all these trips. Critics were saying, why is the president constantly traveling when we have high inflation at home?
A legitimate question for citizens to ask.
Absolutely. But the source takes a different view. It actually breaks down the itinerary of these 15 top-level diplomatic trips. He went to China, Brazil, France, the UK.
And if you just look at that list of countries, it tells you everything you need to know about the strategy. He didn't just go to the West. He didn't just go to the East. He went everywhere. He was hedging.
Let's unpack that. Why China and Brazil specifically?
Well, China is the undisputed infrastructure partner of choice for much of the world now. You go to Beijing to get financing for railways, for ports, for power plants.
Right.
Brazil is a fellow BRICS member and, crucially, a tropical agricultural powerhouse. Nigeria desperately needs to modernize its agriculture to achieve food security. Brazil has the technology and the expertise for that. This is classic South-South cooperation.
And then you have the trips to France and the UK.
That's about keeping the traditional partners engaged. You go to London for finance, for the City of London. You go to Paris to talk about security cooperation in the Sahel, where France still has a major, if complicated, presence.
So the source argues this wasn't just burning jet fuel. It cites NAN News, the news agency of Nigeria, from 2025, and notes that these trips secured substantial investment commitments.
Specifically in infrastructure and renewable energy, yes.
So the argument is that the ROI, the return on investment on these trips, justifies the expense.
The source argues that, yes, it describes this whole diplomatic push as an effort to position Nigeria as an upsurge economic center. The reality is you can't attract serious foreign direct investment by sitting in Aso Rock, the presidential villa, and just waiting for the phone to ring.
Not in today's world.
Not anymore. In a competitive multipolar world, capital is a coward. It needs to be courted. It needs reassurance. You have to go out there and physically sell your country's vision.
It reminds me of a CEO doing a roadshow before a big IPO. You have to press the flesh. You have to tell the story over and over.
That's a perfect analogy. It's a national roadshow.
Okay, now let's look at the institutional side of this diplomacy. We mentioned BRICS.
Yeah.
This has been the buzzword of the mid-2020s, the expansion of the BRICS bloc.
The great counterbalance to the G7.
And Nigeria's relationship with BRICS has been, well, complicated, right? There was a lot of speculation they might join as a full member in the earlier waves of expansion, but they didn't.
They held back.
Then, in January 2025, according to the source, a specific milestone was reached. Nigeria formally joined BRICS, but as a partner nation.
A partner nation, that's the key distinction.
Now, a skeptic might hear that and say, partner nation, that sounds like second-class citizenship. It sounds like being invited to the party, but you can't have a drink.
Mm-hmm.
Why the analysis in the paper framing this as a strategic win? Why not push for full membership?
Because this is where the nuance of interest-based coalitions really comes into play. Full membership in BRICS carries a certain geopolitical weight, a certain baggage, you could say.
How so?
It could be seen by Washington and Brussels, an explicit alignment with China and Russia against the West. And Nigeria, which still has deep economic and security ties to the US and the UK, might not want to send that signal so strongly, so unequivocally.
So it's a hedging strategy. It's strategic ambiguity.
It's a classic hedging strategy. The partner tier gives them access without full commitment. It opens up crucial funding prospects, especially from the new development bank, which is the BRICS Bank.
And that's important because...
It's important because, unlike the IMF or the World Bank, the NDB doesn't usually attach a long list of political or economic conditionalities to its loans.
Conditionalities. That's the dirty word in development economics, isn't it? We will lend you money, but you must first cut your education budget and privatize your water supply.
Right. The BRICS Bank's approach is much more straightforward. It's, we will lend you money to build a dam. Can you pay us back? Good. It's strictly business.
I see.
So by joining as a partner, Nigeria gets a seat at that financial table. It diversifies its foreign missions, but, and this is key, it doesn't completely alienate its Western partners. It's an attempt to reconcile South collaboration with its own complex national interest.
It's walking a very fine tightrope.
It is. But in a multipolar world, the tightrope is where the power is. You become a swing state on the global stage.
Yeah.
Everyone wants your vote, so everyone has to offer you a bigger deal.
That makes sense. Okay, then there's the other big club, the G20. The source mentions the Johannesburg summit in 2025. Now, the context here is important. The African Union was granted a permanent seat at the G20 back in 2023.
Which was a massive, massive diplomatic breakthrough. For years, the G20 would have these discussions about African development with maybe one African leader invited as a guest.
Sitting on a folding chair in the back of the room.
Basically, yes. Now, the AU is at the main table with the exact same status as the European Union.
So by the time we get to this 2025 summit in Johannesburg, Nigeria is invited specifically in its own right.
Correct. And the source argues that this is a very significant move because it places Nigeria at the vanguard of continental leadership.
What does that mean in practice?
Well, the AU seat is a collective one. It effectively rotates. Having Nigeria there specifically as a consistent guest cements its role. It signals a transition from being a symbolic participant to being a real agenda setter for the continent within that forum.
So they're not just there to nod along.
They're there to help shape policy on global debt relief, on climate finance, on digital taxation, all the big issues.
And this all leads us inevitably to the holy grail of international diplomacy. The one institution that has remained stubbornly stuck in 1945, the United Nations Security Council.
The most exclusive, most powerful club in the world.
5 permanent members with veto power: the US, the UK, France, Russia, and China. The victors of World War II. Africa, a continent of 1.4 billion people, has 0 permanent seats. 0 veto power.
It's a glaring, indefensible anachronism. You have the youngest, fastest-growing continent on Earth with no permanent voice on the Council that decides matters of war and peace, very often wars and peacekeeping missions that are in Africa.
The official African position on this is known as the Ezulwini Consensus, right? Can you remind us what that is?
Of course. The Ezulwini Consensus is the unified position of the African Union. It essentially states that Africa demands not just permanent seats on the Council, at least 2, but also the veto power, as long as the veto exists for anyone.
It's an all-or-nothing demand for total equality.
Exactly. No second-class permanent member did it.
The source highlights a key moment in this push. Vice President Kashim Shettima's address to the 80th UN General Assembly in September of 2025. And it says he didn't just ask for a seat. He made a case based on, let's call it, sweat equity.
That's a great way to put it. His argument wasn't just about fairness or demographics. He emphasized Nigeria's long and costly history of contributions to UN peacekeeping missions.
Right.
Nigeria spent decades sending its troops to put out fires in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Sudan, Congo. They have spilled their own blood to maintain the UN's mandate across the continent.
So Shettima's argument was, effectively, we provide the stability, we provide the boots on the ground that enforce your resolutions. We deserve a say in writing those resolutions.
That's the core of it. It's a compelling argument. It connects to a quote that comes up later in the source, but it applies perfectly here. International respect can only be achieved by performance, not by presence. Nigeria is arguing that it has performed. It has paid its dues in blood and treasure.
But the paper also makes a fascinating pivot here, moving from these vast, faceless institutions to individuals. It has a section called Personalities as Power.
This is so often overlooked in geopolitical analysis. We talk about states doing things, but really it's people who make decisions and build relationships.
True.
The source highlights that this entire repositioning project is being paved by a new generation of specific African technocrats who've proven on the global stage that they can run the world, not just their own countries.
So who are the key figures mentioned?
Well, first he mentions Ambassador Tijani Mohamed Bande, another Nigerian, who was president of the 74th UN General Assembly from 2019 to 2020.
Okay.
He navigated that body through some very difficult times, including the start of the pandemic. But the headline name, the one everyone knows, is Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala.
Of course. The Director General of the World Trade Organization, the WTO.
Since 2021. And just think about the timing of her appointment. She took over the WTO right at the moment when global trade was collapsing due to the pandemic, supply chains were shattered, and vaccine nationalism was at its absolute peak.
It was arguably the hardest, most thankless job in the world at that moment.
Absolutely. The institution was seen as moribund, and she had to revive it in the middle of a historic crisis.
And the source lists some of her specific achievements.
It does. It talks about her pushing through policy reforms for more equitable trade. It mentions her key role in finally getting the fisheries subsidies agreement across the finish line, an agreement that had been stalled for 20 years.
20 years.
And it highlights her fight for temporary vaccine patent waivers so that developing countries in Africa and elsewhere could manufacture their own shots.
Now, why is highlighting her role so important to the author's central argument about repositioning? What's the connection?
It's because she single-handedly shatters a lingering, deeply ingrained stereotype.
Which is?
There's a persistent colonial bias, an undercurrent in a lot of Western discourse, that African governance is inherently incompetent or corrupt. Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, with her Harvard and MIT education and her performance at the WTO, proves that African leadership can be hyper-competent, technocratic, and incredibly effective on a global scale.
So she validates the claim for the Security Council seat.
She's the living embodiment of the argument. It's no longer just give us a seat because it's fair. It's give us a seat because we have people who are actually better at solving global problems than some of the people currently in the room.
That is a very powerful narrative shift. So we've built up this incredible, almost rosy picture. Nigeria is joining BRICS as a partner. The AU is in the G20. Intra-African trade is ticking up. And you have African leaders running key global institutions like the WTO. It sounds like the golden age is here.
It sounds like it, doesn't it?
But this is Fulcrum Intel Digest. We don't just accept the press release. We have to look at the friction, the potential points of failure.
The other side of the coin.
Exactly. And section 6 of our outline is critical analysis. The source itself explicitly asks, is this success guaranteed?
And the short, emphatic answer the author gives is absolutely not.
Right.
The paper outlines 4 massive requirements for success. And he's clear. If these aren't met, then all this diplomatic repositioning is just window dressing. It's just a nice coat of paint on a crumbling house.
Okay, let's go through these hurdles because they seem significant. Requirement number 1 is a single voice.
This is the classic, perhaps the biggest problem. The African Union represents 55 member states. They have vastly different histories, economies, and geopolitical interests.
Give me an example.
You have Morocco in the north, which has deep ties to the West, especially the US and France. Then you have South Africa, which leans heavily toward the BRICS bloc, with strong historical ties to Russia and deepening ties with China.
And then you have a country like Egypt with its own complex interests tied to the Middle East.
Exactly. So when the AU representative sits down at the G20 table, whose interest are they truly representing on a contentious issue like, say, sanctions on Russia?
It's an impossible question to answer.
It is. And if they can't agree on a common position before they enter the room, the other powers, China, the US, the EU, will just play off against each other. It's divide and conquer. It's the oldest trick in the imperialist playbook.
So the source warns that a fragmented approach dilutes their collective influence down to zero.
It becomes a wasted seat. Okay. Requirement number 2, economic independence. We talked about the FCFTA, but the source gets much deeper here. It's not just about trading more, it's about what you trade.
Right. If the FCFTA just makes it easier for Nigeria to sell crude oil to Kenya and for Zambia to sell copper to Egypt, that doesn't fundamentally change the dynamic.
Not at all. That just perpetuates the resource curse within the continent. As long as Africa's economy is primarily based on digging things out of the ground and selling them raw, they will always be at the mercy of volatile global commodity prices.
If the price of oil crashes, Nigeria's budget crashes. If the price of copper crashes, Zambia's economy crashes.
That's it. Real economic sovereignty requires industrialization. It requires value addition. You have to move up the value chain.
You have to make the batteries, not just mine the cobalt.
You have to refine the oil into gasoline and petrochemicals. You have to process the cocoa beans into high-end chocolate. The source says that industrialization and trade integration are non-negotiable. Without them, you are just a resource pit, no matter how many summits you attend.
Requirement number 3, and this is the one that I think hits closest to home for the average citizen on the continent. Credibility of governance.
The source is absolutely brutal and unflinching on this point. It comes back to that quote we mentioned earlier. International respect can only be achieved by performance, not by presence.
Let's really unpack that now. What does that mean on the ground?
It means that you can wear the most expensive suit in Geneva. You can give the most eloquent, barn-burning speech at the UN General Assembly. But if back in your home country, your capital city has rolling blackouts.
If your roads are crumbling, if your police force is notoriously corrupt, and if your inflation is running at 30%,
then nobody in that room actually respects you. They'll smile, they'll clap, and then they'll go back to their offices and see you as a failed state.
It completely undermines your leverage. If you're desperately seeking an IMF bailout because your domestic economy has been mismanaged, you are in no position to negotiate a fair trade deal. You take what you're given.
Precisely. The core message is that domestic policy is foreign policy. You cannot project power abroad if you are fundamentally weak at home. The paper emphasizes that African states have to improve transparency, fight corruption, and provide basic stability to be taken seriously as partners, not just as clients.
And that leads to the final hurdle. Requirement number 4, principled partnerships.
This brings us full circle right back to where we started. The danger of trading one master for another.
Right.
The source warns that just because China is coming in and offering money without the usual human rights conditions that the West imposes, that doesn't mean they aren't extracting their own price.
We've all heard the stories about debt traps, about countries having to sign over control of a strategic port when they can't repay a loan.
Exactly. The goal isn't to swap a master in London for a master in Beijing. The goal is to build a web of interdependent relationships among equals. Whether you're dealing with the US, China, Russia, or India, the relations must be based on equality and mutual respect.
So, synthesizing all of this, after going through the potential and the pitfalls, what is the final takeaway from Adiyinka's paper?
I think the main argument is that Africa is in a liminal phase, a period of profound transition. It is demonstrably moving from seeking a place at the table to shaping the menu.
Shaping the menu. I like that. It's more active.
It's the critical shift from token representation, just being in the room, to having substantive power, to influencing the ideas that form the basis of the discussion. But, and it's a huge but, this entire project is contingent on internal cohesion and good governance. The diplomatic doors are open. The world is multipolar now. The opportunity is real, and it is there for the taking. But opportunity is not destiny.
That brings me to the thought I want to leave our listeners with today. We've talked a lot about these high-level things, summits, handshakes, treaties, institutions.
A view from 30,000 feet.
Exactly. But the source keeps bringing us back to this one point. Respect comes from performance. As Nigeria and the AU take these seats at BRICS and the G20, the world is watching, yes, that's true. But I think more importantly, their own citizens are watching. So my question is this: can the internal governance match the external ambition? It's great that President Tinubu is signing billion-dollar deals in Beijing, but do those deals translate to reliable jobs in Lagos? Do they translate to 247 electricity in Kano? Do they mean the roads in Port Harcourt get fixed?
It's the ultimate test, isn't it?
It has to be, because if this repositioning on the world stage only benefits the diplomatic elite and the politically connected, then it hasn't really repositioned anything for the millions of people who actually matter.
If the average citizen doesn't feel the multipolar advantage in their daily life, then it's all just academic theory. It's just noise.
Exactly. And that is where we are going to leave it for today. This has been the season premiere of the Fulcrum Intel Digest. We've been breaking down Africa and the Emerging Multipolar World Order by Oyelayo Daniel Adiyinka.
A fantastic and complex paper, a great start to the season.
Absolutely. If you want to dig deeper into the data, because there's a lot more in the paper on the specific trade numbers and the texts of these agreements, I highly recommend you check out our blog. We have the full breakdown there for you. And please do visit our YouTube channel. We have a visual breakdown of the FCFTA trade routes coming out later this week that really helps you visualize the logistics challenge we were talking about earlier.
You definitely want to see that map. It explains a lot about the scale of the challenge.
It really does. Thanks for listening, everyone. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and we will see you on the next deep dive.